Good afternoon, all. As we reconvene this sixth meeting of our Joint Select Committee on National Security, let me welcome all of those of you present in this room, so-called, as well as the viewing and listening audience. This meeting is being broadcast live on the Parliament's Channel 11 and Radio 105.5 FM and the Parliament's YouTube channel, ParlView. I especially welcome our guests today, the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. Let me introduce myself as chairman of this Joint Select Committee on National Security. I am Fitzgerald Ethelbert Hines, chairman, as I said, and therefore let me ask members. Well, of course, we are supported by the Secretariat, led, of course, by the Secretary to this committee, Madam Jackie Sampson Miguel, and a very competent team who consist of our Secretariat and support the work of this committee. I will now ask the members of this committee to in turn introduce themselves for the benefit of the record and our guests here this afternoon, beginning, of course, with Mr. Richards, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Paul Richards, Vice Chair of the committee.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Senator Nigel Freitas, member.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Janti Lachmidiyal, a member of the committee as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. Keith Scotland, a member of the committee.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ayana Webster-Roy, member.
Good afternoon, Rudal Monilal, member of the committee.
Thank you, all members. And let me, beginning with the Ministry of Education, ask our guests to introduce themselves. Ministry of Education.
Good afternoon, Chairman and members. I'm Jennifer Lachman, Acting Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Education.
Good afternoon, Lisa Henry David, Acting Chief Education Officer, Ministry of Education.
Pleasant good afternoon, Natalie Robinson Arnold, Social Work Specialist, Student Support Services Division, Ministry of Education.
Good afternoon, Mary Bastien, Coordinator, Guidance and Counseling, Student Support Services Division of the Ministry of Education.
Is that it for Madam PS? Is that it for education?
Yes, it is, Chairman.
Thank you very kindly. And then we move smoothly into the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. May you introduce yourselves?
Good afternoon, Chair, Vice Chair, and members, viewers. I am Jacinta Bailey Sobers, one of the permanent secretaries in the Ministry of Social Development.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair, Vice Chair, and members. Vijay Gangaprasad, Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services.
Good afternoon, Chairman and Vice and members of the panel. I am Kathleen Sarkar, the Assistant Director, National Family Services Division. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I, for some clarity, get that name again? Kathleen, what is it?
It's Kathleen Sarkar.
Sarkar. Thank you kindly. Right. Thank you all very, very much. The purpose of this meeting and inquiry is to explore methods to combat crime, thereby circumventing its impact on the vulnerable youth of Trinidad and Tobago. The inquiry objectives include, though not limited to, an understanding of the specific measures implemented to identify vulnerable youth and intervene prior to gang recruitment. 2, to investigate progress made towards the transformation of the prisons and community residences from a punitive model to a rehabilitative model of justice. And 3, to assess the continuum of service options intended to ensure reintegration of persons who found themselves in conflict with the law and might have served sentences as they are to be reintegrated into the society. May I advise all present that all forms of communication should remain silent. In particular, mobile phones should be switched off or put on silent so that it would not interrupt our proceedings. Insofar as your communication in this hearing is concerned, one is expected to mute your microphone except when you are actually speaking. Avoid unnecessary noises when you are unmuted. And please use the raise hand facility and I will recognize you. It's a feature on your system, you're familiar with it. Once you signal it, I will then know that you are raising your hand. And therefore, I will seek your intervention. The hearing will proceed in terms of questions and answers. Members of this committee will ask specific questions of you, the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, and you are expected to answer as directly as you usually do. We will try to utilize the time available to us as efficiently as is practicable, and therefore long-winded answers are not necessary or desirable. Straight questions, straight answers as far as is possible, and we will proceed generally along those terms. So welcome again as I now open this inquiry and invite Member Lachmidial to get the ball rolling, permitting that metaphor. Thank you very much, Member Lachmidial. Madam Lachmidial, I don't know what is, hold a second please, I cannot hear. Please hold. Please hold.
Senator, you need to unmute.
I don't know who you.
And I noticed that when the Ministry of Social Development were introducing themselves, it was difficult hearing them as well, so we could inform the technology experts to attend to that if they can. Please proceed, Member Lachmidial.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start with the Ministry of Education. Firstly, from reviewing your submission, it seems that Student Support Services Division really is at the core of the type of interventions that you would have in place for identifying the vulnerable youth and intervening prior to their gang recruitment. And as they would be the primary point of contact, I suppose, with the schools, correct? Anybody from Ministry of Education?
Yes, it is, member.
Right. So Student Support Services Division. Could you tell me a little bit about that division? You mentioned in your submission that you would have school-based intervention teams. Could you tell me about the structure of the division, whether it's in terms of education districts, how many teams you would have per district and so on, and how it's organized? I just want to understand the structure of the SSSD within the ministry.
Member, I would ask the member of the Student Support Services Division to respond, please.
Sure.
Good afternoon, Mary Bastian. So the Student Support Services Division, we came into being in 2004, and we consist of 4 main units: the School Social Work Unit, the Guidance and Counseling Unit, the Special Education Unit, and the Developmental Assessment and Intervention Unit. That unit consists of about 23 psychologists, some behavioral psychologists, educational psychologists, school psychologists, and clinical psychologists. And we have the responsibility of working with at-risk youth within the school system to assist with removing various barriers to learning so that students are able to attain to their fullest potential. We are organized in a decentralized manner. So within the 7 education districts, we have an SSSD office in each of these 7 education districts, where we have multidisciplinary teams at the level of the district. So we have guidance office, the middle management of each of these units exists at each of these educational district offices. The school-based intervention team that is referenced in the document, that is really a school-based team. It's the way in which Student Support Services Division functions. We respond to behavioral concerns and other kinds of intervention on what we call a tier-level system. So the first tier is what we refer to as the school-based intervention system. And that school-based intervention team is really made up of school-based personnel. So teachers at the level of the primary school, you would have teachers like the head of the, like the senior teacher, as well as 1 or 2 members of staff who may have specialized training, some of them in special education or some kind of social science. At the level of the secondary school, we will have the deans involved in this level of intervention. And they are really the first port of call. They would identify and do what is referenced in the committee document as the surveillance, as it were, to identify the students who may be at risk. And they would do some initial intervention at the level of the classroom. And when that does not work, then referrals are made to Student Support Services Division, and it goes into Tier 2 level intervention, where either member of the various units may be assigned to the case to offer direct intervention.
Okay, so if I'm understanding you, the school-based intervention team is really someone who's at the school, a teacher at the level of a dean or a senior teacher.
That's right, yes.
But it's not, you wouldn't have in every school someone who is particularly trained in terms of, not in every school you would have a teacher who would, let's say, be trained in counseling or psychology or something like that.
Well, the idea behind the school-based intervention team, it is hinged on our school-based management structure. So it begins by, expecting that the school system on its own will take responsibility for all students. But at each school, primary and secondary, I would say overall, at least 80% of our schools will have a guidance officer. Yes, so they would have the opportunity via consultations at this first level to be able to get some strategies to use with those students. But when that doesn't work, then it is bumped up for Tier 2 intervention by the specialists themselves.
Okay, so you're saying about 80% you roughly would think that they have someone who is fairly trained to fulfill that position.
Yes.
Okay. Now, when you bump up to the Tier 2, what would that consist of, and what are the qualifications of the persons who would form the team that would be referred, that would be engaged at the Tier 2 level?
So at that level, we would have school social workers. So minimal qualification of the school social workers will be an undergraduate degree in social work. right? Then we also have guidance officers or guidance counselors, and they usually have a first degree as well in a social science. Most likely it would be psychology. Some of them also, like the social workers, also have master's degree, either in social work or in one of the social sciences. We have special education teachers also forming a part of that tier 2 level intervention. And they would have, of course, a bachelor's degree in special education or a master's degree in special and inclusive education. And then we have psychologists as well, but they will form tier 3 level intervention. And they are master's level or beyond in terms of psychology qualifications.
And these tier 2 and tier 3 personnel, they are, as you said, assigned to each district, each of the 7 educational districts?
Correct. But the tier 2 are working at the level of the school.
At the level of the school as well?
Of the school, correct. So they are not functioning from district offices. In the primary school system, we work with a cluster system. So we may have a cluster of 3 schools who would be assigned a school social worker, a guidance officer, a special education teacher, and they would rotate at different days at these specific schools. At the secondary school, we have an assigned, usually it's an assigned guidance officer based on the numbers of staff as we have them distributed currently. It's usually an assigned guidance officer at the secondary school, and some would also have assigned social workers and special educators.
Is that to each school, or is that clustered as well? At the secondary level?
For the guidance officer at the secondary school, it's not clustered. So it's per school, but for the service being offered by the social worker, the special educator, it is clustered based on our current numbers.
Right. So when we're speaking about the numbers, the persons who form these tier 2 and tier 3 teams, which would be for the cases that require a little more intervention, is the ministry fully staffed with the number of persons that you require? And are these positions permanent positions or contract positions?
Well, I can tell you the numbers. I can be informed by my social work colleagues with the numbers for social work. We have 142 social workers. We have about 256 guidance officers. And for special education, we may have under 100 members of the special education team. For the DAI unit, we have just about 25 or so.
What unit is that?
The Developmental Assessment and Intervention Unit.
Is that
we have
5?
Yes.
Okay.
There is a mixture of contract and permanent positions.
Would you say that, so you've given me the numbers, but I have no idea how many schools those persons are servicing and how many, you said clusters of about 2 or 3 schools. Do you think that your staff complements at these tier 2 and tier 3 levels are sufficient?
Well, I will have to get back to you in terms of the details as to how our student ratio or school ratio to staff members, what that looks like. So I will have to get that information back to PS, and that can be forwarded to the committee.
Right. So, I would very much like to know, but I'm concerned about the numbers of what you call the developmental persons. If it's less than 25, this is for the entire ministry employed, all 7 districts?
Yes, but based on the way in which our intervention levels are organized, their numbers are really not going to be as high as the tier 2 numbers. But we can provide a little more intervention a little more information via PS as to how our intervention structure is organized and why the numbers will in fact be lower for the DAI unit.
Right. So the ratios of persons in each category you identify there to students and to schools, because from what I understand, they have to physically rotate to schools, some of them who are in clusters. If you could let us know that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on. You spoke about in your submission, one of the services that you would offer would be external referrals. Tell me a little bit about the external referrals. What type of, and you mentioned specifically for children who are impacted by drug addiction, external referral for specialized intervention. What are some of the external referrals? Who are these professionals that you would refer to? How are they engaged? Is there any, what's the cost like for these things and the process that you have to do?
I will refer to my social work specialist colleague to give some more details with regards to the specialized intervention. With regards to the cost, I will defer to our CEO. Yes.
Pleasant good afternoon.
Okay.
What will happen with respect to our external referrals? We will refer mainly to community policing, not TTPS, like community policing for that further intervention if it's if it's crime related, or we feel that our students are that at risk and need that specialized intervention. Something like drug abuse, we refer and seek the guidance of NADAP, and likewise. So those are just a few examples in terms of our external referrals, as well as child guidance clinic, which is our child psychiatric unit at the Ministry of Health.
So most of the external referrals would be state type referrals then. When you say external, it's external to the school and maybe external to the ministry, but it's not the engagement of private service providers, like let's say a psychiatrist, psychologist, a drug therapist, persons who give therapy and stuff like that. It's not that type of intervention.
No, for that psychiatric intervention, we'll use the state child guidance clinic mainly.
Right. Okay. So most of the resources that you rely on also come from the state.
Yes.
Okay. All right. No problem. So I guess that answers the cost factor, because most of those things would be free. Well, would not be at a cost to the ministry. What I was trying to get at is whether there's a significant cost to the ministry of having to engage external professionals to assist with some of the cases. But have you seen any cases where it was necessary, for example, because the facilities just weren't available through the state, where it was necessary to ask or to recommend that a child be referred to some sort of professional intervention that was not available through the state, and how is that managed?
Most of the time, when it comes to our children, that intervention is managed through Children's Authority, the Children's Court, Student Support Services Division, Child Guidance. So the state really have a very good resource base in terms of intervention for children.
Okay, no problem. Right. There was a question about information coming to the attention of the schools about gang affiliations. You spoke about monitoring for recruitment and trafficking in illegal substances. Have you had a lot of cases involving the use or selling or trading or trafficking in weapons, firearms, particularly through the school system? Apart from drugs, we always hear about the selling of narcotics through the school system. But what about firearms? Has that presented a problem? Have you have a lot of reports like that of children being involved in that type of activity?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Thus far.
What about the interactions with the courts? We now have the children's courts, and we have what we call the CHINs, the children in need of supervision. Yeah. So once you would say that you would interact with the TTPS, but are the schools getting the information, and are they participating in proceedings that are before the court when children are taken before the court? Before we had the Children's Court and the Children's Act of 2012, they used to call them uncontrollable, and children could be brought before the court and they would go before a magistrate for being uncontrollable. And I know that sometimes the magistrate could direct that the school would be that somebody reach out to the school. I think now they try to formalize it a little bit more when you have one of the CHINs that the school is directly involved. From your information, is there a system where the children's court, once they make orders, that the school is informed, and what will the school do if they are aware that an order has been made for supervision or some sort of intervention for the child by the court itself?
Sure. There's a strong collaboration between the Children's Court and Student Support Services Division, and children that attend school. On those cases, we case conference with Children's Court guidance officers and school social workers. And if there's a need for our psychologists in our DIU units, they also case conference with respect to our children.
Okay. So they are liaising with the, do they participate in any of the proceedings before the court? Like, would they be asked I've seen some circumstances where children were before the court for offenses, and they reached out to the school to provide reports and so on the children in order to assist the court with sentencing. is that something that Student Support Services Division would get involved and I would monitor? Because you see, what I've noticed is that depending on the school, sometimes the assistance is very forthcoming in terms of having a guidance counselor who is there on site and who will be very well trained and will be participating in the proceedings and take a lot of interest in the proceedings. But sometimes we don't have a lot of participation from some of them. So can you just give an indication of that?
There are social workers of the court, and Student Support Services will normally give status updates on cases that we have intervened in when necessary and requested by the court. So they to avoid duplication of services as well, and for additional information, as well as intervention that we provide for our children.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. I can hand over to someone else. So,
thank you very kindly, Member Lakshmi Dial. And just before we go to Mr. Richards, one member of the public communicating with us is asking whether we propose to get before us the operators of the CCC, the MyLab, the MyPad, the Cadet Force, and to hear what they have on offer in the context of our inquiry. It is something we have considered and we'll give deeper contemplation to going forward. Member Richards.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon again, everyone. My first question is to the Ministry of Education, the acting PS, and the acting Chief Education Officer. In the context of student performance, which is, of course, an indicator of one of the metrics of students who may be deemed at-risk students, the student performance from primary through secondary school, inclusive of those who drop out of school for whatever reason during primary school, those who don't transition from primary to secondary school, and depending on what year you look at, that can range anywhere from 900 to as much as 2,100 students don't transition from primary to secondary school. Does the ministry have a risk factor checklist that kicks in if a student is, one, underperforming at a particular level consistently, which means the student may have either familial issues, some learning disability, and if that is not checked or remediated, it puts the students in a risk category, or also information that may be correlated about the student performance on a term-by-term basis to red flag that student as entering a risk category.
Ministry of Education. Somebody needing to unmute?
Sorry about that. We were just shifting.
Yeah. All right, thanks.
So there are multiple things happening in response to students who may find themselves moving into at-risk categories based on academic performance. The role of the Student Support Services Division, we do play a role, and again, it begins with those school-based intervention teams internal to the schools. There are systems in place to recognize when students are beginning to fall below what may be expected as standard performance, and to put some kind of remediation to work. However, when that remediation gets to a point where it is not resulting in any positive action, referrals are made to the Student Support Services Division, and for the most part, those will be picked up by our special education unit. When the special education unit receive those referrals assigned to them, they usually would begin by doing some screening to identify exactly where the challenging areas are in response to those learning issues. And then, of course, intervention plans are mapped out, implemented, and monitored. As monitoring takes place, and we may see some students improving and coming out of the at-risk category academically, or we may see that we're not getting the kind of intervention, responses to the interventions that are taking place, then sometimes those students are referred to our developmental assessment and intervention unit, where they may receive some kind of further assessment known as a psychoeducational assessment, which will be conducted by our psychologists internal to the Ministry of Education. Sometimes, if the number of psychoeducational assessments are beyond what we can accommodate at the time, some outsourcing may be done. And so that is how that progression is made in terms of intervention for academic challenges with our students. We also recognize that there are some students who develop learning gaps, not because they have cognitive deficiencies, but because of issues of poverty and socioeconomics, etc. And that is where the other arms of Student Support Services Division, specifically our school social work arm, will do some targeted intervention, not only with our students, but at the level of the parent and family system.
Now, thank you for your answer. Now, what I'm hearing in this interface and what I've heard in a committee which I have the honor to chair, the Social Services Committee, is that a lot of the ministry's intervention, the ministry's intervention division is Student Support Services, which by Professor Conrad Dennis, is that his name, the director? Professor Dennis Conrad's own admission is under-resourced and understaffed even before the pandemic, and the load on that division has increased student support that is significantly since the pandemic. So how is the ministry reconciling that critical, heavy role of student support services in the absence of adequate resources moving forward? Because certainly, given the trends we're seeing in some student districts and some schools, a lot more needs to be done.
Yes. So before CEO makes an addition, just 2 weeks ago, actually, we had a meeting with the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, as well as the TTPS, recognizing that we need to strengthen collaboration with our other state partners to be able to mitigate for some of the resources, the challenges with resources. So we are trying to work with other arms of the state that offer support to children, recognizing that Ministry of Education is but one arm. We also collaborate with the Office of the Prime Minister, Gender and Child, but we recognize that the level of collaboration that is needed to make the significant impact that is required, especially in this time of COVID, we need to make some improvements there. And through the guidance of our minister and our chief education officer, we are working on strengthening those lines of communication, specifically with TTPS and Ministry of Social Development at this time. I don't know. CEO,
was the CEO want to add something, or can I go ahead?
Good afternoon, committee. Just only to say that we have made some progress in moving to online services so that we can provide for our students who may be experiencing difficulty throughout the pandemic. We have made contact with them via telephone, we even visit homes during the pandemic and also through online services. We have developed programs which we have been rolling out to our students via their online classes, and we continue to adapt as the circumstances require.
Thank you. Now, in addition to focusing on the students, what is best practice internationally is while one focuses on the students, there are certainly, the data will present that some districts may not be meeting benchmark performance levels as established by the Ministry of Education. And I've had sight of documents in the last couple of years of entire school districts and entire schools underperforming, suggesting that the issues are systemic rather than individual. Can you comment on that? And what is the ministry doing where those school districts or particular schools in other jurisdictions, they call 6 schools because the school systems are not meeting the needs of the learners? What is happening with that sort of paradigm in Trinidad and Tobago?
Okay, so with respect to the performance at the district level, certainly each district has its own cultures and different issues that may not be relevant to others, that may be specific to those districts. And we would try to tailor our interventions to suit those districts. And in terms of schools that may need additional resourcing, we try, within the constraints of the resources available to us, to provide more intervention and more support to those schools that may require such. So, apart from the student support services, for example, we have the other support systems that help us, because if you are hungry, then you won't be able, for example, to access the education. So we provide the support such as the meals and such as the transport. At certain schools, for example, you may even have systems in place to provide uniforms to certain children where it's necessary. So what we try to do is to tailor to the needs of the different school populations within those districts and continue to work with them to based on our level of resourcing.
Would the ministry be able to provide the committee in writing? Because I don't think it would be prudent to have the information broadcast of their data tracking of students and or districts that may be considered at risk by whatever benchmarks you have established, and the records for remediation, so we see what the trends are moving forward. And also, finally, before I get to the next speaker, and this question will also go to the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, is the ministry able to provide data on a checklist for risk factors, including students or learners who may be young persons who may be exposed to violence, including abuse, exposed to drug use, etc., which are also risk factors, putting students in light, moderate, or heavy risk factors for as vulnerable youth and more vulnerable to gang recruitment.
Okay, so I will let Ms. Robinson answer which of those factors we may be able to provide data on.
We generate data from our individual intake, our social functioning assessment, other risk assessments that we conduct at the ministry. They will be able to give us sufficient information on our youth that are at risk from our assessments.
So we'll be able to get in writing data from educational districts in terms of benchmark performances, averages, number of students who have been flagged as at risk for whatever reason in the metrics, and remediation success rates?
There will have to be a comparison analysis between student support services and school supervision. Student support services will collect the psychosocial aspect and supervision will collect the academic aspect. So there will have to be a collaboration for us to do that kind of analysis.
Is that possible for us to get? Or is it beyond the resources?
Yes, the two division is within the Ministry of Education. So we can discuss it and get back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
All right, thank you very kindly. Let me invite Madam Webster Roy to interrogate some of these matters. Member Roy.
Chairman, I wanted a follow-up question to the social work specialist, Ms. Robinson, but it will be in writing, please. Could you provide for me what is the international best practice in terms of the number of school social workers to student population? So if you get that information and submit it in writing for me, as well as for the same goes for the guidance counselors, best practice in terms of ratio of student population to guidance counselors, please. I know one of the previous members would ask in terms of what is our ratio, but I want the best practice, international best practice, and if we are meeting the standards, right? So that's one. Two, you mentioned that there's case conferencing at the children's court, and the school social workers and guidance and support would usually be involved. I want to understand what is the relationship between the Student Support Services Division and the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services Family Service Division, and if the Family Service Division is also involved in case conferencing as well.
Well, most of the time we look at it through the children's court, and the The court themselves, what happens is they will refer to the necessary agency that best fit the need of the child. So we can speak to student support services when they refer our children at the school system. For us at Student Support Services, we also liaise with National Family Services, separate and apart, where we do our external referral if they need be. And we refer to National Family Services mainly for long-term family intervention.
Okay, is there a formal relationship in place, or is it case by case? For example, this social worker might have a good relationship with somebody in family service division, so you link up, or is there a formal relationship in place and protocols that all officers across the board will follow?
Children court is more formal between Student Support, Ministry of Education, and National Family Services. It's more case by case. It's informal.
Do you think that's the best? Do you think that's the best approach, or do you think having a formal system in place where we know once a child has to come to Student Support Services for any intervention, there's a direct relationship with family services, so the intervention with the family could happen immediately?
Well, I'm of the view that we should strengthen our collaboration, not only with National Family Services, but all the agencies that work with children, Children's Authority, Children's Support, Student Support Services. We need collaboratively to strengthen that approach and our collaboration.
Another question. Given the current circumstance where our children, most of them are at home, and they're not in the physical school environment, and some students still don't have access to devices to access online learning. How is the school social work? How are the school social workers interacting with our students to ensure those who have been at risk before we went into this home learning situation, online learning situation, that they still get the intervention required to help them from entering into gangs or abusing substances and that sort of thing?
So we still do our referral system and the SBIT in the same way virtually. We do our intervention, the individual, group counseling, psychoeducation, our parenting and education, all those are done virtually. We have some communities, for example, in our Northeastern District, the Toko, Matlas area, where they will have challenges with connectivity. We do face-to-face intervention with our sessions, of course, observing all COVID-19 protocols. So we are doing it with smaller numbers, and we do our home visits for our children who are deemed at risk once a referral. And we also have a hotline that is available for public, for our parents, our teachers, our children themselves, that they can call in if they're in need for any intervention and they see themselves or others at risk, they can call.
This question may be for the guidance officers, right? Hi. In the earlier this part of the discussion, you have indicated that we depend on other state agencies for support. So, for example, if you need a psychiatrist, you refer them to the public health system. Yeah. What is usually the waiting time for a student to access a service within the public health system? Is there preferential treatment for students referred by the Student Support Service Division, or is it go into the system and wait just as long as everybody else? What is in place?
Well, we have a mixture of both according to how the level of risk that the student is actually presenting. So over the years, we've been able to get to the point where we have a direct relationship between our district-based staff at Student Support Services Division and an agency like the Child Guidance Clinic. So once the district-based staff of SSSD finds that, listen, we would have offered intervention up to a point, and we really need specialized intervention, and a referral is generated for the parent to access intervention, we tend now So it's much better. We've gotten to this point over the years where the state agencies would tend to accelerate their intervention, recognizing that they are not starting at ground zero. Because remember, we are sending now a status update, which indicates we would have done work up to this point, and so we get some preferential treatment. But that is not across the board for all agencies, right? So it happens for some and it doesn't happen for some, but it is a work in progress, and it is as we develop relationships as an organization across the different agencies. So it's not a general response.
There's no formal process in place as yet.
There's some formal process with the Ministry of Health, as I just shared, but more informal with agencies.
Is the ministry working towards putting formal relationship in place?
We are working at this point in time with tighter and more formalized collaboration with Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. So we've gotten to a point with Ministry of Health, and we're working now towards formalizing better with Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. Yeah? And we have a relationship as far as possible. I said we have a formal enough relationship with the Children's Court as well as the Children's Authority.
Okay. Another question for Ministry of Education before I go to National Family Services. Is there any program, or has the ministry considered putting in place a program in all schools geared towards preventing gang culture in schools, or to help to safeguard those students from falling prey to gangs on the outside? Is there any program in place across all the schools, or is it based on institution by institution you will develop something?
Right. So across all schools, we have 2 levels of what we call universal intervention. From the student support services end, that is the main remit of the guidance and counseling unit. So we conduct needs assessments with all the schools, and we are able to identify the kinds of programs, preventative programs, that we need to implement across the board so that we are able to treat with the underlying reasons why our young people will gravitate toward the gangs. And so that is happening across the board on what we call a universal way. And that is happening via the delivery of psychoeducation sessions, all happening now online, being delivered by guidance officers and guidance counselors, and also happening via our HFLE curriculum that is happening at the level of the classroom, being delivered by some of our teachers. But the guidance and counseling unit, that is our particular emphasis on doing developmental and preventative work with our students from infant 1 straight up to Form 6 year 2. On any kind of issue that we anticipate may present as a psychosocial crisis for our students before they present.
All right. Okay. Member Webster Roy, that's it for this round.
Ministry of Education. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Before I bring Member Scotland to you, Ministry of Education and Ministry of Social Development, I just want to say I've listened to your answers to the very pertinent questions asked by members of this committee, and without any untoward implication, I find the answers a little glib and a little brisk. But I wonder, the reports out there are teachers are saying students are becoming more and more difficult, more challenging. In some cases, they're afraid of them. In some cases, they're hitting them. In some cases, they're making sexual advances to female teachers. They want to fight with the few male teachers around. The police are reporting the student population, the youth population is becoming more challenging, more daring, disrespectful, unafraid of consequences. Parents are reporting this. I'm aware from the statistics you shared when Member Lachmidial was speaking that you have 256 guidance officers, but we have almost 800 schools. And the 200 social workers, those numbers just don't seem to add up. And I'm just asking very quickly before I invite Member Scotland, I wonder if you are really assessing accurately the magnitude of the problems and the challenges that faces us, notwithstanding the brisk formulated responses we've had. And more than that, I would like to know very quickly before he comes in, whether your own department, short-staffed as it might be, low levels of productivity as generally is the case, poor attitudes on the part of some of your workers which exist across the public service. So it's not any specific attack. I just wonder whether these things affect you and whether you are really understanding the magnitude of the problem in front of us. Before Mr. Scotland comes in, a quick answer, please.
Mr. Chairman, my officers' answers were actually from the heart and not glib. But in the general sense, yes, we understand the magnitude of the problem, and as with all problems, you need to approach them from several different aspects. So, for example, some of the issues you spoke to were teachers being unable to handle the students. Our teacher training division is organizing training sessions on a number of issues, and one of those issues happens to be teaching teachers how to handle students within the classroom. We even have sessions on how to handle students within the virtual classroom. So as the issues arise, we try to find the different avenues to combat them, not just from one specific angle, but from all angles. And as well, we recognize the need to engage all of our stakeholders. This is why, for example, we have our parenting and education sessions in which we help engage our parents and help them to work with their children, and we collaborate with them on all fronts in order to tackle the problem, which may be nationwide or even global.
But isn't it true, with a very few exceptions, you can hardly get a proper PTA meeting in many schools?
PTAs, that's an interesting question, Chairman. We are able to get children, the parents of children, for example, at the primary level more so, and at the early levels of the secondary. And our parenting and education sessions are targeted towards those parents who are most in need, for those children who we recognize as at risk. So we try harder. I often say that my officers from the Student Support Services section, they operate more from the heart and than anything else. So they will go the extra mile. It is part of their makeup to go the extra mile, to connect with those parents and those students, to try and intervene and ensure success.
Member Scotland, the floor is yours.
Chairman, good afternoon. I ask you to forgive my video. In 15 minutes' time, it will be sorted out, I am told. But I would like to proceed with my questions, please, with your leave.
Most certainly, Mr. Scotland.
I address this to Ministry of Social Development. What program do you have in place in order to attack in its embryonic stages the lure of the life of crime, particularly gangs, and the life of crime from young people? I want specific programs that are in place, specific programs.
Yes, Member Scotland, thank you for that question. I would say that we don't have specific programs speaking to that particular issue. What we have is programs that we treat with providing support for the family, and through those programs we would trust that we will be able to ensure that the children, the parents are provided with the type of support that they need so they can take care of their households, including their children. So I'm talking there about support, whether it's psychosocial support from the National Family Services Division, or transfers in terms of providing food support and other types of financial supports from the Division of Social Welfare. Through those mechanisms, we would expect that the family will be supported so that the children would not be forced to tax. So we would also provide some assistance to the parents through parenting programs so that they will get the skills to be able to provide that type of support to their children. And also we are looking at a developmental program for those clients that will come through our doors, primarily the vulnerable. As you're aware, those are the persons that we would treat so that we will be able to capture what is happening in the household. So this is a new program that we call Step Up, and through Step Up, we will work with families in a number of areas, and it will include the psychosocial, so that we will be able to determine whether there are children at risk in the household to gangs, joining gangs, and so on. We'll be able to through our Step Up program. So that's how we would deal indirectly more than directly.
Chairman, Chair. Through
Mr. Scotland?
Chair, through you, may I respectfully that this is not the time for indirect approach. This is a time for a direct approach. I speak particularly from my angle of nemesis and for the proud constituency that I have been privileged to represent. And I feel, and I would like to just share, there is learning on the not all being critical. I'm just suggesting so that we can attack this problem in its embryonic stages. You know, madam, that even in, and Chairman, this is not a political statement, it's a fact. Even though in a time of little, the government has focused resources on social services because we want to keep those who will fall through the net, want to keep them afloat. Why don't you utilize the persons, listen, the late Wayne Chance? Why don't you do the reading from the Mennonites in New Zealand, the Maori movement, that would have assisted in young people, helping them to turn them away from crime? I know Member Richards would have learned of the history of restorative justice that started, and Howard's there's reading out there that can assist us. So the next time you...
It appears, members, like we are losing Mr. Scotland. So unfortunately, he was in full flight.
Chairman, if I could just add one thing.
Yes, please, Mr. Richards. So sorry that we lost Mr. Scotland.
PS Sobers and ministry officials. I think he's coming back in. I think he realizes he's been...
All right, I think we really have lost him. So, Mr. Richards, please continue.
We have to be reinvented. Have I lost you?
No, you're back with me now. You did for a while. Right. Please continue, Mr. Scotland.
The second question that I have to ask of you, Minister, what are we doing to strengthen the family and the role of the family in the community as a tool in fighting crime, reducing youth involvement in crime? I give you one example. I was about to enter manhood. I was about 16 years liming on the block at night. And my mother came and found me on the block and embarrassed me and took me home,
Yes.
What are we doing to and involve the men?
Let me direct your very potent question to P.S. Sobers, who heads the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services, and which ministry has about $6 billion a year to spend on these matters. Let me direct that question to Madam Sobers. P.S. Sobers.
Thank you, Chair. And I just want to start by indicating that most of that $6 billion is really in the form of transfers to vulnerable households, and we know that transfers alone cannot help this situation.
P.S. Sobers, let me intervene very quickly to have you know that the public is listening very closely to these deliberations, and they will not know what the meaning of the word transfers would convey. Could you just speak in a language that those families out there, as Mr. Scotland is urging, can understand?
Sure, Chair.
Most obliged. Please proceed.
$6 billion goes into the financial support, the financial grants that go to the vulnerable households.
Give us some examples then.
Speaking to public assistance, disability assistance, food support. These are the major grants that will go to the households, and the senior citizen pension, but those other grants are the ones that primarily would assist with the socioeconomic situation in the vulnerable households. I wanted to respond to Mr. Scotland with respect to the issue of the indirect as opposed to the direct interventions, is that we are also working with the Office of the Prime Minister to address the whole issue of the direct interventions. We understand that there is need for greater collaboration, and as he may or may not be aware, they have established the intersectoral committee to implement the child policy, the national child policy, and in that policy there are a number of strategies that we will work with the Office of the Prime Minister and other agencies to implement that will address the whole situation of arresting the young people, the children, before they reach the point that they will get involved with gangs. So I speak to, for example, the National Child Safeguarding Strategy, and also we have in that child policy programs to strengthen community resilience, which he was just speaking about, and community-based mechanisms to support children. On that basis, I would be happy to inform the committee that the ministry, through the National Social Mitigation Plan, which was approved by Cabinet, is also working on a national resilience framework, which is a framework that will ensure that the population is resilient from the cradle right up to the older persons. And through that resilience framework, we will also be teaching values, attitudes, and behaviors, and using other methodologies to get children to the place, which we have found in some of our studies, of being resilient so that they are able to cope with the difficult circumstances that may face their households, yet steer away from getting involved with criminal activity, including involvement in gangs. So we have a number of activities.
Before I give way further to Member Monilal, who has some questions for us, could you give a very quick example, Madam Sobers, in all of a minute of it or a minute and a half, of some example of your direct intervention in the life of a young person or young persons in a family in the context of what you have just said, from your knowledge from that ministry?
Okay, so I think because it's direct and it's dealing with the actual family, I will ask Ms. Saka to respond, because National Family Services...
Please, Ms. Carter.
Please, and Ms. Saka. Ms. Saka, could you respond?
Thank you, Ms. Saka. Ms. Saka. Is she unmuted?
I am now, sir.
Yes, Madam, Mr. Scotland wanted to know an example, or he wants to know that we make more direct and urgent intervention in the lives of these youngsters to steer them away from criminal activity. Can you offer this committee an example from your tremendous experience of a direct intervention in those terms?
Definitely. We have two ways of intervening in these situations. One would be referrals from the Children's Authority, where we offer counseling support to these children as well as to their families. We also do interventions that are sent to us from the Children's Court, where the social workers meet with these children and we do the interventions that way.
Chairman.
All right. Yes,
Chairman,
Mr. Scotland, come again.
This is directed to the Ministry of Education.
Please, your last question, Mr. Scotland, before Member Mooney comes.
Yes, it is my last question, Chairman. Ministry of Education, what are we doing to change, to include in the curriculum the issue and to deal with the issue of crime and educating and trying to inform our young minds as they're in their formative years of not going to a life of crime? What is going on in the curriculum to deal with that?
Thank you, Mr. Scotland. Education.
Member, in terms of our curriculum, the Health and Family Life Education curriculum deals with the whole child, and it focuses on areas which help the children to develop that resilience and to understand the issues that they will have to make choices, to understand how to make good choices, the right choices. And that curriculum is from early childhood straight through to Form 3, where we have HFLE, and as well, it would be infused in other areas of the curriculum. So, for example, in discussions in social studies, discussions at the Form 6 level, and so on. And this is how we treat with it. We're trying to teach our children values and how to make the correct decisions when circumstances confront them.
All right. Member Monilal, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chairman, and good afternoon again to colleagues and officials of the both ministries before us today. I have 4 issues to raise, and I'll prefer to raise them one after the other. The relevant authorities can take a note and then respond together rather than stopping. The first matter I wish to raise is a matter concerning data. Unless it went before and I wasn't paying attention or slipped out of the room temporarily, can I ask the ministries of both education and social development whether we have any type of comprehensive policy-oriented data, studies, brief studies, not thesis and so on, whether the ministry through their respective research departments have the research on the children in the secondary schools and in the primary schools, in the system, so to speak. What is the incident of children at risk and the sort of characteristics, the breakdown, where they can be found, what are defining qualities, elements, including what Mr. Scotland raised about issues of family and so on, issues of institution collapse. So that my first issue really is that while we have various divisions and several ministries working and trying their best in the circumstances, do we have integrated, comprehensive, policy-oriented data that speak to this issue across both ministries? That's my first issue. The second issue I wish to raise is an issue, and I will root it in this way. Our youth, and this committee is interested in that youth at risk and criminality, our youth are more at risk if they are not engaged in learning. One of the crises we face immemorial, I'm certainly not blaming the current officials and so on at this stage. One of the problems we face is staff shortage. I can tell you, and I have had some responses from principals in the Victoria area, that in the Victoria area, for example, there are staff shortages because the ministry is awaiting the Teaching Service Commission to appoint or transfer teachers. And while that is happening, students at this time are not being taught. They don't even have teachers who can reach out to them online because, as you know, many of the students now are at home. And this is creating a crisis, as I understand it to be. This is an urgent matter of the shortage of teachers across the various districts, because it is well felt that if the child is is seen after every morning by teachers, regardless at this stage of the curriculum and so on, it is in the best interest of the child to be involved in a learning environment. And I'd like a response on this teacher shortage. And what is the crux of the matter? Is it the Ministry of Education and the Teaching Service Commission not gelling? Is it recruitment? Is it what? Is it, for example, the freeze on public service employment? Is that policy, which may have been well-intentioned, is that creating a further crisis in education and criminality? The other related matter to that, this is a related matter now, has to do with children who require what is called the aids because they have learning disabilities and so on. Now, officials of both ministry, I can tell you that it is common knowledge, we believe it is common knowledge, that a lot of the children who get into crime, and I say a lot because you can correct me with data and so on, but a significant amount of children who get into crime are children with learning disabilities, which if that had been addressed early on, they may not have been vulnerable to gangs, vulnerable to criminality and so on. And that is a problem that has to be addressed and dealt with in the bud, so to speak, at the primary level specifically. And we are further informed as members of parliament that there is a crisis of some kind as it involves aids, the persons who are brought in by the Ministry of Education with the purpose of assisting those children with learning disabilities. And I draw reference, Chairman, through you, to the document of the Ministry of Education, because I think it is cited by the Ministry of Education as well. This document here, I'm looking at page 5 of the document of the Ministry of Education. I'm looking at number 7, that deals with mechanisms in place to assist students with learning difficulty, learning challenges, and so on. And they speak of student support officers, aids to this. We are informed that I would like the Permanent Secretary in Education and her team to tell us exactly how many children in the system at this date today requires the assistance of these aids. Tell us how many aids have been recruited by the Ministry of Education, how much is needed, how many of them their contracts ended and they were not renewed. Our information is that the teaching aids, the aids that these special students with disabilities, learning disabilities require, the ministry has not been hiring, and we have a waiting list now. I would like to know about the waiting list. How many children out there are on the waiting list for aids by the Ministry of Education to assist those children with learning disability who are in probably the most vulnerable situation as far as the lure of crime, as far as the trapping into criminality and so on is concerned, because lawyers tell us that when they go to court with matters later on and so on, many of those persons before the court appear to have some type of learning disability and so on. So my question really is, what is the incident now as it relates to the amount of aids that are required? How much have been recruited by contract? What is the shortage and the impact this shortage is having on the waiting list for children? I'm further informed that even when parents seek to hire aid for the student, and that aid may be someone who was in the ministry and their contract wasn't extended, the Ministry of Education has put a spoke in the wheel and indicated that those aides cannot work with the children or cannot come to the school for one reason or another. So that was my third issue, the time frame to fill the vacancies that exist for aides for children with learning disabilities who are generally, but not always, susceptible to criminality. And my final area, Chairman, and I like Mr. Scotland raising issues of our childhood, and we have to draw strength from the past, because at this stage it's hard to draw strength from things around us. What the Ministry of Education, could you indicate the extent of your involvement with extracurricular activities, with culture, with sports, When we were growing up, there were vibrant debating competitions, drama competitions, arts, and so on. And I believe because of my years of experience in public service as well, that in the school system, we need to increase the amount of activity taking place as it relates to culture, to the arts, to debating, to drama, because unless you don't have an environment to absorb the youthful energy of the children, they will go into other areas that appear to be more attractive, appear to be alluring, appear that will give them, some great life that they can have quickly, and so on. And we know what that will lead to. So that my question really is the Ministry of Education involved in the arts and culture and sports and debating, drama, and so on. That I will leave
Thank
it there.
you very much, Member Moonilal. Ministry of Education, you have had 4 potent questions from Member Moonilal. Could you get addressing them and indicate where you have to put it in writing, particularly the question about the number of aides and all of that? If you don't have it now, we'll take it in writing promptly after this meeting. Please, Ministry of Education.
So, Mr. Chair, I will start with the second question, which had to deal with the staff and teacher shortage. Up till last week, the Ministry of Education and the Teaching Service Commission engaged in discussions, and the issue of the transfers came up. This has been passed to the Teaching Service Commission, and they are working assiduously to ensure that the transfers are effected. And we are working to provide them with any additional information they may require to facilitate that process. With respect,
did you say they're working assiduously? How do you know? That's a cloistered virtue. You don't know what's happening in there?
They have indicated to us in our discussions with them that they are working on getting those transfers effected.
Have they been true to their word from your experience?
We had 70 or so transfers that we asked for. To date, I think we got 32 back from them. So they continue to work, and we continue to wait on them.
How many years have that taken? Quickly, before you continue.
That is within the last couple of months, but the end of last.
Very good. Good to know. Please.
With respect to, there has not been a freeze in hiring there. We are doing, in that meeting with the Teaching Service Commission, we also spoke to ensuring that we have heads, for example, interviews for heads of department in the schools to facilitate the whole teaching and learning process. And these interviews will commence next month. And we are working together with them in order to ensure that this is done. We continue to interact with them to ensure that whatever they need in order to facilitate the hiring of staff, because we feel it from our point of view. So we continue to facilitate the Teaching Service Commission to ensure that they are able, to hire the staff that is required. With respect to the aides, the teaching aides for the children, we are in the process of finalizing a note to cabinet to hire the aides, or to get the aides back on contract. At this point in time, I'm unable to say exactly how many aides we are going for, but that note is in it's more or less final stages. We've had a little back and forth in terms of trying to ensure that we get the best fit possible. But in writing, I can provide for you the number that we are hoping to have cabinet's approval for. And with respect to programs and the arts, culture, and sports, and so on, a lot of these, programs are indeed integrated into the curriculum as well as in our extracurricular activities. And we at the ministry recognize the need for these programs in order to keep our students engaged and to examine the full gamut of their giftedness, because our children have many talents, and we need to ensure that we engage them and keep them and hone those talents. So we recognize the importance, and we continue to provide the coaches, for example, for the sports, the arts and culture, the teachers who will provide the VAPA in our schools. And in a number of our schools, we do have debating and drama, and we will continue to work at the level of the ministry to ensure that we continue to inculcate these practices in our school populations because we understand the benefits thereof.
Thank you very much. Let me invite Member De Freitas to come in at this juncture. Member De Freitas.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I've had the benefit of listening to most of the contributions that have gone to the day thus far. And I just wanted to sort of get some insight. I don't know if this might have been answered in the answers there before, but I guess I wanted a more direct answer. So a lot of what we've been hearing, and more specifically what we heard from the TTPS the last time we had this meeting, was that gangs are sort of recruiting younger and younger people, getting into the realm of preteens and teenagers. And to me, when I heard that, obviously that brought up the question of individuals at that age still being in the school system and whatnot, and therefore you have sort of the clashing between those two entities. So my question to the Ministry of Education first really is, are you aware of how many children within your system, that is the schools, that are actually in gangs right now? Ministry of Education, I don't know if they heard me.
We don't have that data because we don't classify, have that classification. However, we are working strongly with TTPS, community policing, and programs like Hearts and Mind to work with our children that are at risk.
So you have at-risk children. So I understand that. So when I hear the word at-risk, I'm thinking, okay, they could be exposed to gangs and they could be, at risk of entering a gang and whatnot. But I'm looking at it from the standpoint of the other side of the coin, where the ones that would have entered gangs already, which to me is always hard to sort of pull them back out of that. But because we're hearing that they're recruiting younger and younger individuals, then to me, some of them would already be in the school system. And I'm pretty sure I heard earlier on in this inquiry that you have children who, for whatever reason, are pretty hard to deal with in that sense. And, you have programs in place where you would have counselors to talk to them and whatnot. But I really wanted to find out if there was a correlation where a principal, for example, may be aware that a particular student is in a gang. And, what do they do to treat with that? Do they contact the TTPS to say, listen, this particular person, we think that they're in a gang, could you check this out? I mean, in the absence of the anti-gang legislation, I don't know what could be done, but to have that particular student around other students, then it sort of goes against everything that you're trying to do in relation to at-risk students. Because whereas you're talking about the family home and the environment that they come from, you have a situation now where you may have a student who's in a gang influencing right there in the school. So is there any connectivity in that sense where you're aware that a student is in a gang, and therefore you have that ability to talk to the TTPS and say, could you come in and help us out with that particular situation?
Most of the time that information is known to the TTPS. What is known to us is the behavior that they manifest in the school system, and that is what we work with.
And that's what you work with, so you treat with that? Okay. Yes. All right, so Mr. Chair, if you'd permit me, I have a question for the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services. What is the status of the families policy, and how would such a policy support the prevention of gangs?
Thank you very much for that question, Member De Freitas. The National Family Policy, actually, it's in draft. We were able to complete the draft to go to Cabinet. We are sending it within the next few weeks to the Cabinet in the form of a green paper so that it will be approved for consultation. So over the next few months, we will have those consultations that will formulate a white paper, which will be the approved policy going forward. In terms of the family, of course, most of the policy will treat with strengthening the family as a whole, obviously providing holistic direction for family well-being, placing the family at the center of research and policy, and more than that, providing a framework for the development and coordination of policies and activities among the social sector agencies. How will this family policy assist with the whole issue of gangs? It will enable the family to have the kind of support that will make it more cohesive. It will reduce the vulnerability of families, improve the resilience of families, so that at the end of the day, once we address the socioeconomic situation of the family and the psychosocial, we trust that, less children will be falling through the cracks and getting themselves into gangs and other types of criminal activities. So that's what's happening with the family policy, and that's how we expect to help with this particular situation.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Sobers, for your response to the questions from Member de Freitas. Member de Freitas, do you have another question?
I just had one a quick question, and it's really centered around the same family policy. Now, in other countries, sometimes they would have a particular standard that they would want to treat with a particular thing in society. So, for example, if you're dealing with education, you want to have a certain level of education in the country or accessible to individuals, starting from early childhood centers coming right up to university.
Yes.
So from the family standpoint, which is a little bit tricky, because, families are structured in so many different ways, how do you intend to address the issue of a standard by way of quality, of what a quality family unit would be in relation to your policy?
Are you talking, Mr. de Freitas, about the Huxtable, like a Huxtable's family?
Well, I don't want to actually put any ideas out there like a Huxtable.
All right,
family.
then go ahead.
The trickiness behind it is that you have so many different types of families. So how is it that you're going to be able to have a standard across the board to know where things are lower or higher?
Thank you.
I think what we will be looking at is to work towards functional families, and that's how we will have to define it. What is a functional family? A family that is fully supported, that is able to stand in its own feet, provide for the household, and ensure that the members are, at the end of the day, able to contribute to the development of society and fulfill their full potential. So I think we'll have to define what a functional family is, whatever form it takes.
All right, thank you very kindly. Now, before I present my own questions, the public, as I say, are very, very in tune with what's happening here. And one member of the public is asking, how do you react to complaints? And this is for the Ministry of Education. How do you react to complaints of one guidance counselor allocated to serve 3 secondary schools? Likewise for educational psychologists. Education, please. Ministry of Education. Want to know how you're dealing with when one guidance counselor and one educational psychologist is attached to 3 schools with 750 children each. Secondary schools.
Mr. Chairman, we work within the constraints of what is presented to us. Rather than leave the school without anyone to service the students, while we submit that it is not at all the best fit, we try to ensure that there is some sort of coverage for our students.
But the caller, the person who asked the question, is implying that that is just not good enough. It is not a good enough response to the challenge and the problem that is affronting us in the society.
And I submit so that it isn't. I agree. I'm in agreement.
Thank you very much. Another member of the public has asked, has any study been done as to whether drug use is a conduit of youths into gangs, and is enough drug awareness being conducted in schools? That's the question, and I can tell you this. I've had 3 examples of primary school students who admitted to me and others that they were using marijuana in primary school. What is your reaction to the question? Has any study been done, Madam PS of Education, to determine whether drug use is a conduit to youths into gangs? Because they have to leave lunchtime and go down the road to get the joint. And they go in the wrong places to get it. Madam PS.
Chairman, I would have to admit that no study has been done at the moment.
All right, then we'll roll on that. The next question by a member of the public is, why is the Ministry of Education seeking collaboration with state ministries, and I'm just reading the question as it has come, with state ministries only and not also private and NGO agencies to help them accrue additional help for the old age under-resourced student support services? So this caller is saying that the under-resourced and old age and time-worn student support services, they need help from private individuals, private NGOs and so on, and you all are not seeking that help. What is the reaction of the ministry to this?
Chairman, I'd like to submit that we are working with NGOs and other agencies, and we are contracting.
In which case, this committee would like you to document that, put it in writing, your response to that, and let us see which NGOs the schools you have been working with in the context of the question. Can we look forward to that?
Yes, Chairman.
All right, and then another question from one other member of the public. What about funding to trade, internship, arts, sports programs to provide at-risk youth with other avenues to spend their time? Well, this was dealt with from Dr. Munilal's question. So I think we've had a bit of a response to that. But more than a response, we need some action. So let me now present very quickly my own questions to you, because we have spoken a lot about at risk today, and I have a sense of what that is, and members of the public too. But when the Ministry of Education speaks and the Ministry of Social Development speaks about at risk, what do we mean? Full range. What do we mean by at risk?
Chairman, if I may, it is a term that has been used historically, and it is very difficult to define. But the Ministry of Education would have had a checklist to determine whether a student is at risk.
All right, give us some elements of that checklist so we can understand, because one of the discussions, one of the examples we had today was poor academic performance. But I know that there will be other elements. For our sake, could you tell us what are some of the other ingredients, elements, checklists in respect of at risk? What do you look for?
When we look at risk, we look at the home, the school, and the community, and our students' involvement in there, and the relationships, the systemic approach. And we look at factors within the community, factors at home that can be further categorized. We also looked at individual, we look at drug use, we look at mental health, a set of varying factors that will deem the risk and our students that are in need of the supervision and guidance.
All right. Let me ask another question. Have you found, Ministry of Education, evidence of gang activity in the primary schools and in the secondary schools? Gang activity in the context of what you would have been hearing about, what the police were dealing with when the anti-gang law was in place. Have you seen evidence of that in the schools? I went to a particular Chin's institution recently, and inside of the facility on the walls, I saw written there the names of 2 gangs. In other words, the students there clearly understood what the gang thing meant enough to write it up on the wall. Have you seen that in our primary schools and secondary schools?
They may be in some schools, particularly our secondary schools. But as was said earlier, the gang, classifying our students in gang, that our children who are in gang, is the responsibility of the TTPS who identify those things. What we look for is a warning sign for potential violence with our students, and we do both universal and targeted intervention to help minimize behaviors as well as to build resilience.
Just to have back to my earlier proposition that I am not so sure whether the Ministry of Education is appreciating the severity, the magnitude of the tsunami that is coming down on us and has been coming for some time. I can identify at a personal level, because of my personal intervention, 3 schools. One where for 10 years on the trot, the children of that school has been performing below the national average. And I got that in answer to a question in the parliament. The records of that school show that for 10 years, with all the staff at the Ministry of Education, guidance officers, counselors, and the works, with principal, with 16,000 teachers in the system, and a full complement perhaps in that school, those children had quietly been performing below the national average for 10 years. That is school number 1. School number 2, I visited a secondary school where the students were at large, not going to class. The teachers told me the children misbehaving. The students told me privately, in the absence of the teachers, many of the teachers not coming to class, they're in the staff room studying, they're not coming to school. They almost abandoned the students. And the students were in uproar on the particular day. I had personal experience of that. And thirdly, I know of a school where perhaps for the last 3 years, they offer no more, in a very populous neighborhood, they offer no more than about 8 candidates for the SEA on an annual basis. And of the 8, perhaps 7 of them perform below 30%. So with all that I heard today, with all the teaching service commission, counselors, guidance, all of that, those are 3 real examples. What say you in terms of the Ministry of Education's response to this depth of challenge?
Chairman, if I could just add also, if you please.
Yes.
You know, without casting any aspersions and understanding the chairman's seeming frustration, and I'm not judging in any way effort of ministry officials, teachers, administrators, etc. All I am hearing is working closer, strategic policy, finalizing policy, engaging partners, stronger collaborations, improving resilience, wonderful policy statements. And without judging effort, because we can't, there is absolutely nothing presented today to test effectiveness, because there's no data presented. Dr. Munilal asked for data, I asked for data. And in the absence of data, how can we know if any of these policies are working, should be amended, or should be changed? So it's actually very frustrating for me, because while I understand the ministry is, like every other agency, is under-resourced, these are difficult times, we're in a pandemic, they just saying, well, many students have been engaged and we have been reaching so many families, is just simply not good enough. We have to be provided with data to see what numbers of students are underperforming, what districts they are in, what are the underlying factors contributing to their underperformance, so we can see if the policies and the strategies are effective.
And whether those,
we're just guessing.
And whether those segment them into gangs. So Ministry of Education, thank you very much, Mr. Richards. Ministry of Education, we might want to ask you, not might, we certainly will want to ask you, and we will direct some questions to you for some written responses.
Chairman, I sent a document to the Secretary, just sorry to interrupt you already, with a list of data requests that I'm sure the Secretary will provide to you and the other members.
All right, wonderful. And I'm looking forward to the ministry's prompt reaction to that. And this brings me to one and my final question at this juncture. Member Monilal raised the question, quite rightly so, of teacher shortages, because I think it is safe to say there are shortages in terms of teaching staff. And of course, he did mention the recently announced, perhaps within the last 2 months, government's position of a freezing of public sector further employment. Very, very recently. But these problems that we are talking about have been with us now for at least 20 years. So that recently announced policy, in my own view, doesn't account for some of the issues that are in front of us today. However, your suggestion, Independent Senator Paul Richards, member of this committee, and in terms of my own feelings, is that notwithstanding shortages, those who are already on deck in the Ministry of Education, be they public servants, be they administrative staff, or be they teaching staff, I am asking the ministry to consider whether we are enjoying optimum energy and optimum productivity from those who are already on deck in terms of attacking and responding to the obvious problems that are in front of us. What is the reaction of the PS, Ministry of Education, to this? Are we getting bang for our salary buck? Are people performing optimally in the system? Madam PS.
Chairman, like everywhere else, there are people in the system who perform optimally, and there are people who do not perform optimally. And, we treat with that. I know the Ministry of Education has a very comprehensive training program to assist. As you rightly said, we have constraints, but we are attempting to work as best as possible with the constraints that we face.
You see, because the implication here, Madam PS, is, and before I open the floor to my colleague again, I think Minister Webster Roy wants to come in again. The implication here is this. If we are trying to segue these youngsters away from gang and other antisocial activity, and we have all the things that we heard from you on social development in place, if we are not optimizing our efforts, in that sense, Chokdas is probably right. We make another one. We are contributing to the problem if we are not exerting best efforts. That's the issue, Are we contributing to the problem by our own lethargy, our own absenteeism, our own concern to get 2 and 3 degrees while we are on the job? And it's not just about teachers, all of this. Are we, according to Chokdas, Dr. Hollis Liverpool, making another one? Your response to that before I allow Minister Webster Roy to come in again. P.S.
As I indicated, Chairman, we as the CEO would have indicated, we are trying our best to have our teachers, heads, and so on board. We are working with the Teaching Service Commission. There are procedures for monitoring teachers and so on. And as I said, there's training available as well for teachers and students and parents. And I, from where I sit, I believe that we are working very hard to allow our students the opportunity to optimize their potential. I recognize that there are areas that we need to work on, and we will take cognizance of those areas to continue to work on.
I give you the assurance, subject to the concurrence of my colleagues on this committee, you all will be before us again very shortly. But before that, let me invite Member Webster Roy and then Member Lachmidial to come in with their questions. Member Webster Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one more question to ask. And
you're more than welcome.
I wanted to find out if we know exactly how many children we have in the system who have learning disabilities or special needs, and if we have the right ratio of students to teachers. And I'm particularly interested in this question and the response.
Chairman, if I may, I would like to provide that response in writing, please.
Thank you very warmly, and we look forward to it. Member Lachmidial.
Thank you, Chairman. Perhaps in writing as well, or if they could tell us now. Let me just contextualize the question. I do what we call duty counsel, where you assist minors who are arrested and brought before the children's court and when they are at the police station. And in most of those cases, we have follow-up reports done through the court system where the child is identified by the guidance counselor as having a learning disability. I'd like to know how many children who are treated as chins, how many children who are on or have received attention in some form or fashion from the police or the children's court do you currently have in the education system, and what is the ministry, or what does the ministry have in place to assist them with any identified learning disabilities, or to even determine whether or not they have those disabilities? Because it's a segue off of Dr. Manilal's question, where it was identified that many children who are lured into a life of crime, it's because the school system, they aren't performing optimally, and so they are attracted or they are targeted in getting into crime. So how many children are straddling both the education system but are before the courts, or in some form or fashion identified as chins, and have identified learning disabilities?
Member Lachmidial, before you depart your question, could you, for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, say what you mean by chins?
Oh, I apologize.
It's a term of art.
Sorry, yes, children in need of
supervision.
Children in need of
yes, what they used to call wards of the court.
Correct. What these
back in the day?
Yes, so the courts identified as having either behavioral problems, which are just borderline committing infractions of the law, or who have actually stepped over the line of...
in conflict with the law, yes.
Yes.
Thank you very kindly. And we look forward to that in writing. Madam Pierce, Ministry of Education. Let me give the floor again to Senator Richards. Mr. Richards? It seems as though he's not unmuted. Mr. Scotland?
Chairman, a follow-up to the ministry with the Ministry of Social Development and the Ministry of Education. Through you, Chairman, I think the time has come now for concrete policies, not platitude. Can I ask when we can expect from the Ministry of Social Development, concrete plan for the reduction, for the luring away of young minds, impressionable minds from crime? Concrete plan. And can I ask respectfully, the Ministry of Education, when is the ministry going to introduce in a curriculum fashion things or policies and programs geared towards the luring away of a young man from a lifetime? Direct questions, Chairman, with a time frame.
Thank you. Question, Ministry of Education.
If I may, Chair, respond. PS Social Development. With regard to concrete plans, I would say we do have some plans on the board, but in terms of this specific issue, I believe our plans will roll out when we begin working with Office of the Prime Minister and the other stakeholders in the sector on the strategy that are in the National Child Policy. And I believe within the next, I will say probably 6 months, this will materialize, because the first meeting of that committee was today as we work with those stakeholders on this specific issue of young persons joining gangs.
Members, in fairness to the Ministry of Education on this score, only recently, a few months ago, the My Part program, which is the military-led academic apprenticeship and reorientation training program, left that ministry and is now seated in the Ministry of Youth Development and National Service, which I now lead. That is a program for youth who were challenged and who were in circumstances that were not very sanguine, so to speak, and they would take them in under military discipline and have them trained in particular skills and apprenticeship and represent them to the world. So in that sense, that is a direct intervention. That program continues, and I have taken this suggestion and I'll offer it to the committee that we bring the My Part and the My Lat and the police youth clubs and all of those groups who do direct intervention in those circumstances so that they could tell us what role they play. Member Munilal, do you have a question for the team in front of us?
No, no, Chairman, not at this moment.
I thank you very kindly. Mr. De Freitas?
No, Mr. Chairman.
All right, and we missed Mr. Richards a while ago. Seems like he's back with us now. Mr. Richards, do you have any further question or questions for either of our guests here today?
No, thank you. Just to know that I've submitted the list of questions to the Secretariat for some data from the bodies before us. Thank you.
All right. In other words, you have several questions, but you request the answers in writing. I thank you. Now, folks, it is 5 p.m. It is about the time that we had scheduled to bring these proceedings to a close. So let me invite, in this order, the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services and the Ministry of Education to say a few words, closing remarks, before we bring this public hearing to its conclusion. Madam P.S. from the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services.
Thank you very much, Chair. And on behalf of the ministry, we want to thank the committee for the opportunity. We would have listened. We will take on board all the suggestions, recommendations that have been made. We also want to commit to working with our stakeholders, the Ministry of Education, the Office of the Prime Minister, and the many other social sector agencies to ensure that we address this issue directly, and in particular, because our ministry is responsible for data and for research, having the Interministerial Research Council under us, that we are going to explore what we can do to ensure that we have studies that will enable us to determine how we can move forward with the correct policies and the relevant programs to treat with this issue. So again, we want to say thanks for the opportunity and also thanks for the direction that has been given by this committee.
Thank you very warmly. Madam Pierce from the Ministry of Education.
Thank you, Chairman. I didn't get the opportunity to speak about the policy, so we just want to inform the committee that there is a national education policy. We have a national school code of conduct, and schools have their individual management plans. So we have structures in place, but we look forward to the recommendations of this committee to indeed strengthen our processes and to ensure that our students are afforded the benefit, to ensure they contribute to the country positively. Thank you.
I thank you very much. Well, I gather from your obvious ease and comfort, you thoroughly enjoyed the company of our committee here today. We are a very valuable resource. We make laws, legislators, and some of us are policy makers by virtue of being in government. And of course, as members of parliament, we hear and see it all. They come to us with all manners of issues. So part of the responsibility of a committee such as this is to assist you in doing what you must do as worthy public servants. So we know you enjoyed our company today. I suspect you will be with us to enjoy it again, not too distant future. And we would like to thank you as we usher you safely out of this space as you return to your workstations and or to your homes. We thank you very much for coming. Look forward to your answers in written response. And thank you very much on behalf of our committee. God bless.
Thank you, Chair and members.
Thank you very much. And therefore, this meeting is now suspended so as to permit the public servants to demit this virtual space. Thank you very much. And Madam Clerk, you will tell us quickly when the deed is done.
Hi, Chair. I'm not seeing them in the room, so I think you all are off air.